that have been brought to light around issues like leukemia, clusters of leukemia. There's an unwillingness to be free and open with the information about that. I think that we should be very suspect in any industry which wants to be so secretive and yet claims to be entirely dedicated to civil purposes. It's the risk of an accident, and we've looked at the risk of an accident. I think, to be honest, the design of nuclear power stations these days does deal successfully with a lot of the issues around the risk of accident. It doesn't in the least bit deal with the issues around the risk of an attack. And in these days when people of many political parties, not necessarily principally my own, but many political parties talk about the risk of terrorism, that we're living in an age of everlasting engagement with the terror threat. Well, how dare they talk up that issue so substantially that we're willing to commit billions more pounds of taxpayers' money to dealing with that threat, if they're not willing to accept that a nuclear power station is a very vulnerable target. Or indeed a nuclear waste storage facility is a very vulnerable target. And we don't know, we have no idea how to clean up after such an attack. No more idea how to clean up after such an attack than we have how to deal with nuclear waste and render it safe in the first place. We simply don't know the science. Give it 50 years, give it 100 years, we might be able to crack that one, but we can't yet. Other risks which are not necessarily about the operation of a nuclear power station or the storage or movement about nuclear waste. Other risks which are about the rest of the world. The nuclear proliferation threat. It's very clear that the byproducts, the waste byproducts of nuclear energy, civil nuclear energy, can be put to use for military purposes. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have the same saber rattling over Iran. If it was genuinely the case that a country can develop nuclear power stations without any impact, any potential impact on their ability to militarise the byproducts, then we would be perfectly happy to say that if Britain's going to have new nuclear power stations, why not Iran as well? I'm not happy to say that. The UK government, even though it supports nuclear power, the UK is not happy to say that, and so I think that's clearer evidence that there is a proliferation threat. There's an additional risk that I want to mention, which is about the economy. Much has been talked about the concept of peak oil. We're heavily dependent on fossil fuels, on oil. We're an oil addict economy globally. And, you know, in another debate, I might wax lyrical about climate change, about the utter folly of a society which thought it could shunt the entire energy systems of a planet, which have been going on in the same direction for millions of years, into reverse, unlock the energy and the carbon that's been locked up for millions of years under the oceans, under the land, that we could do that without consequences. It's clear that we can't do that without consequences, but we're still oil addicts. We have to break that cycle. And we know that not just because of climate change, but because of the idea of peak oil, that at some point, very soon, it may even have happened yet, we might only know it in retrospect, the cost of extraction reaches such a point that the cost of oil begins to spiral out of control. We're already looking, we had a debate the other week where the Minister, Stuart Stevenson, talked about the idea of a $200 barrel before too long. It may be that that's just the tip of the iceberg, and that in coming decades we'll see the phenomenon of peak oil wreak havoc across the economies of the world. Well, uranium, like oil, is a finite resource. At the moment, there might be of known reserves maybe 50 years. That's, I would say, optimistic. I think when you're getting that far, you're starting to look towards much dirtier sources of uranium, which take a much higher energy input to process and use as a nuclear fuel. But let's imagine that the world goes down the route that the UK government is currently proposing. New generations of nuclear power stations. That 50-year expectation is based on current consumption. If we go down the route of saying we're going to power the world with nuclear power, we'll use up those reserves all the quicker, and I simply don't buy the idea that we can start going to these other sources of uranium which are difficult and which take much more energy input in order to get energy out of them. Let's look at necessity. Now, the two priorities here are climate change and security of supply. And it's perhaps unfortunate for Murdo's position in this debate that he comes to talk about how, I'm sure, useful nuclear power is in terms of security of supply this week of all weeks, when we've seen how the terrible problem of intermittency affects nuclear power stations. We hear a great deal about how intermittency affects renewables. Well, when we see nuclear power stations being shut down for safety measures, that's far more of a problem for security of supply and reliable supply than a wind turbine stopping turning, because the wind's not blowing in that part of the country at that time of day. If you start to lose the power from nuclear power stations, you're losing a much greater part of your energy. In terms of energy security, so we need to recognise that there are no natural local sources of uranium. In terms of domestic energy security, providing our energy from within our own borders, nuclear power simply doesn't cut the mustard. We still depend on other countries to give us uranium. And the idea that if we didn't have nuclear power, the lights would go out. Nuclear power provides a certain proportion of our electricity use. It provides a much smaller proportion of our overall energy use. And until recent years, there were very few days when our energy consumption would have been failed if we didn't have that nuclear element. It's only because of steadily increasing energy consumption that we have a problem here. And if we want to resolve this problem in a way that's much cheaper, creates more jobs, and reduces the costs and the risks of all the costs and risks that I've mentioned, it's about reducing energy consumption. And we can do that very easily by decentralising our energy systems, which wastes vastly less than we waste at the moment, and also encourages communities locally to develop a sense of self-reliance. Finally, on climate change, because this is the other aspect of necessity in developing an energy policy for the future. Climate change is not an optional extra anymore. It's not a wee extra nice strand of government where we want to be nice to the planet. The sustainable future is the only future that we have available to us, and all political parties now recognise that they need to be taken seriously on climate change. But even the most optimistic estimates suggest that if we doubled our capacity of nuclear power and the billions of pounds that would cost to achieve by 2035, if we doubled the capacity of nuclear power instead of losing what we've got, the very best that we could expect is to cut the UK's CO2 emissions by around 7 or 8%. Now, by 2050, we need an 80% cut. And that's a conservative estimate, a small c. That it may well be that as the science goes on, we find it needs to be 90% or even deeper cuts. This simply is not a goer, and there are far greater cuts, overall savings in our country's carbon emissions that we can achieve for the same investment if we have the will to do it. So I suppose I just wanted to finish by summing up. I think I'll make this a wee tad over my 15 minutes, but the top level message, if we want to resolve the security of supply issue and the climate change issue, is use less and waste less. If we want a sustainable future, a sustainable future energy policy, that has to be about renewable sources of energy. Nuclear is a non-renewable source of energy. It's based on stuff which is in the ground and which will run out. And finally, it's been speculated that in the future we'll have genuinely renewable, sustainable forms of nuclear power, nuclear fusion maybe. Well, it's a long time, I think, before we've got a ground-based nuclear fusion source that's in any way economically viable, let alone physically viable. There's one source of nuclear power that I can support. It's the source of nuclear power that has been operating at a safe distance at 93 million miles from the surface of the planet since time immemorial. It's providing us with all of the energy we need. It's driving the biological systems, the weather systems, the tidal systems, all of the energy that is bathing us, that we're simply swimming in. And it comes from the one nuclear fusion source that's up there in the sky. All we need to do is harness it. We've already begun to do the work that develops the tools that allows us to harness it. And the job for us, for our generation, if we don't want to saddle the next generation with even greater problems in climate change and in waste, is to finish that job and make sure that we're able to exploit the renewable sources of energy that are all around us. Thanks very much.